I think when the history is written, people will point out that this was a tragic waste of quality manpower and equipment on an operation that had no chance of success. There are several levels of importance, though. One of them is that from the vantage point of Moscow and the Russians, this is a NATO invasion. I think it's important to make that distinction. These are not all Ukrainians, and the equipment they are using in many cases is very Western. Western tanks, British tanks, Bradley armored fighting vehicles from the United States. I don't know how much they had in the way of rocket artillery from HIMARS or something else. I know that there's some air defense weapons involved, but all of it smacks of, NATO, not necessarily Ukraine. In addition, I've heard estimates of at least 2,000 men inside this fighting force who are obviously not Ukrainian. They appear to be British, American, and how many may also be Polish is simply unknown. So this is a very bad thing in my judgment, because it signals to the Russians that they really are de facto already at war with NATO. I don't think NATO and most of its members want anything to do with a war against Russia, to be frank. This may be high adventure for the United States or the British, maybe the Poles. I don't understand why they would feel that way. But for everyone else, this is a very dangerous proposition. I've been contacted within the last 24 hours by a number of people in the Balkans, NATO members, saying, under Article 5, we are not obligated to join in a war against Russia that is offensive. We joined NATO because we saw it as a defensive alliance. We don't want anything to do with a war against Russia. So I think it's had an interesting impact on both sides of the border. The Russians have decided NATO's at war with them, regardless of what we say to the contrary. And you have NATO members saying we want nothing to do with this. So that's one level. Second level is the original goal, at least as I'm increasingly being told by supposedly knowledgeable people, was to reach Kursk, and in particular, the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, the Russians have controlled the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhia very early on in the war and have never given it up. Ukrainians have tried to damage it and cause an accident. Fortunately, none of that has happened. The Russians have secured it. And I think there was a view that, well, if we can get to the nuclear power plant and we can hold it, it can become a bargaining chip. Well, that's not going to happen. Then perhaps they were going to damage it in some way, which of course would cause an emergency and poison the environment. I suppose that's another possibility. But they never got very far. They got perhaps 25, 30 miles, and they have now lost all of their major equipment, all of the major platforms, tanks, artillery, electronic warfare equipment, everything you could think of that's rolling stock has been destroyed. The Russians have targeted everything that they could with, of all things, Iskander missiles. That carries a very, very powerful warhead, whether it's a fuel-air explosive or high explosive. The missile normally goes at a range of 250 to 310 miles. So they've been able to do this damage without exposing very many of their soldiers to the fight. On the other hand, we know that we have the Wagner mercenaries on one flank of the Ukrainians, and on the other side, you've got the Chechens and the Russian volunteer corps. So I guess, they're now firmly cut off. They are, in effect, what the Russians call a fire pocket. They can't get back into Ukraine because that escape route has been sealed off. So they're stuck in this desert, if you will, of trees, forests, rivers, swamps. They haven't accomplished anything of value except to go get themselves killed in great numbers. And I don't see any evidence that they've inflicted much damage on the Russians.
So that begs the question of what would be the main objective of Ukraine and NATO for the invasion of Russian territory? Because, well, you mentioned the Kursk nuclear power plant, and this is also what seemingly was hinted by several Ukrainian commanders, but this is not something NATO would admit to, because our populations would probably not care for us trying to seize Russian nuclear power plants and, the consequences that might have. And also, given that that objective have now seemingly failed, it's also it's being brushed away. But what is left? I hear about buffer zones and using it as a chip in the negotiations. On the Western side, there's this huge obsession, it seems, with humiliating Putin, thinking we will spark some regime change. How are you reading this? Because this doesn't seem to make any sense. Even from day one, Western and Ukrainian commentators, they pointed out that this is a huge gamble, throwing all your best men and equipment into Russian territory.
Well, the last time that I looked at estimates that I trust, out of the original 12,000 Ukrainian forces that went in there, and once again, there were 2,000 plus non-Ukrainians, at least British, American, and potentially Polish involved. They're looking at 3,000 dead and perhaps 4,000 casualties at this point. In other words, this is a rapidly shrinking force that is being compelled to fight on the defensive. And as I think you mentioned in your introduction, you're going down a road which is a very obvious avenue, and you're very easily detected, very visible, and so you can be destroyed by any number of different weapon systems. So it doesn't seem to have made a lot of sense. It's a narrative. I mean, if we want to go back and look for historical examples of similar attempts, I suppose we could go all the way back to the Bulge during World War II, when the Germans launched an offensive to try and reach Spa and ultimately Antwerp. Spa, of course, is where all the fuel was stored in 1944-45. It didn't work, and the generals actually told Adolf Hitler that it had very little chance of success. But they were operating on the assumption that we were going to emasculate them, implement the Morgenthau Plan, and turn Germany into what it's increasingly becoming right now, a nation without any scientific industrial base. But I don't know, other than what we've already discussed, what the purpose was. Now, clearly, the Russians, I'm sure the Russian General Staff is very embarrassed. They were not watching this area carefully. I don't think they thought something like this would happen. And that's always a mistake. You should never assume that your opponent, however badly damaged he is, cannot strike back in some way. The problem, though, is that a wounded animal, even at the end, is still somewhat dangerous. Now I think the discussion in Moscow is finishing the war. I think that's very much on the table. And one of the things that has happened to me over the last 24 hours, I sat with someone who's lived in Russia for 10 to 15 years, and is very familiar with the place and knows a number of people there. And this lady was explaining to me that the Russian population is infinitely more enraged and upset over this than anybody in Moscow. Now, let me explain this. I think the Russians are offended, they're angry, and they're frustrated that this war has been allowed to drag on and drag on and drag on. Now, we know that President Putin is nothing if not patient. He's been very deliberate. On one hand, he has tried to minimize Russian casualties, which is a remarkable development in the history of Russian military affairs, because that was one of the last things historically that people considered. And I salute that, because that's something we should all be concerned about with our forces. At the same time, I think he's also been keen to end this because he's not really interested in governing Ukrainians. But now he's being told by his own population, you've got to go the distance. You've got to march all the way to the Polish border. If you don't do this, this war will not end. The West will turn Ukraine into this poisonous platform that will be a resurgent problem for us forever. The only way for us to be safe in Russia is to cross the river and crush the Ukrainians once and for all. And I know that's something he doesn't want to do. So that's the bad news. We in the West should be very concerned about that. I mean, one of the advantages of neutrality for Ukraine was that you placed this buffer zone that you mentioned earlier, a buffer zone between Russia and the eastern border of NATO. We all saw that as on balance, a positive development. The likelihood of any incidents occurring, of any future friction occurring, seemed to be remote. That's the way we looked at it in the year 2000. And that was the attitude at Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe. No one thought in terms of dragging Ukraine into NATO.
But I was curious, though, how do you think Russia's gonna have to respond to this? Because I saw this speech by Zelensky, in which he was making this point that give us Europeans, you should give us permission to do all this long-range strikes, and effectively should join in more into this war, because this invasion effectively proved that the Russians do not have any red lines they're willing to uphold. And this is quite the Russians, of course, are hearing this, and that's why they're presented with this dilemma. But it's very hard, as you pointed out. It's so obvious NATO's involvement in this invasion, not just in the planning, but the execution as well. Even at the moment when they're trying to trap the Russian soldiers on the south side of the same river, I was watching HIMARS strikes on these bridges today. So it's very much, the Western weapons, the management of the weapon systems, the mercenary, probably the war planning, the intelligence, both before or during this invasion. So, and it is a point by Zelensky, isn't it? We and NATO have now crossed this border between proxy war and joining in on an invasion, and Russia surely has to respond in some way. But how can they do this? Much like Iran, I feel that both countries are in this dilemma. On one hand, they have to retaliate to restore their deterrent. On the other hand, if they do, you risk World War III. So what do you think Russia can do?
Well, I think Russia has many options. First of all, I think they'll clean out whatever is left of this original force. It will be annihilated. And I'm sure that they will begin to maintain persistent surveillance all along their border. I don't think something like this is likely to happen again. Having said that, I think the Russians will look for other ways to make life miserable for us and for Britain. Most of the planning, as I understand it, in preparation for this, went on for several months in Great Britain. And I think it was interesting that on the 20th of July, this General Cavoli, who is the American military commander in NATO, the supreme allied commander in Europe, made a statement that he was very, very optimistic because the Ukrainians had a great plan to win the war. This was on the 20th of July, which leads me to think that he was probably talking about what was coming with this penetration into Russian territory. I think it's been a terrible mistake. And I think a lot of people will lose their lives as a result of this. So I think the Russians will press forward. And I'd be very surprised if they don't press right into Kiev. I mean, if I were sitting there, I would look at this and I would be disappointed, as President Putin is, and sort of shake my head regarding the stupidity of this action. But I would say it cannot go unanswered. And I think there will be drastic action. But I would also look for problems elsewhere. The Russians have a great deal of influence in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Mexico. They have a lot of influence in the Middle East. There are roughly 80 to 84 countries in line trying to join BRICS. There is a sense of global fatigue associated with dealing with us. They see us as intrusive bullies who are constantly annoying them, holding them hostage to World Bank, International Monetary Fund loans, and so forth, all of which we obviously control. They're sick of it. So a large portion of the world, if you start running the numbers, you get up to 90 to 100 states, or only 134 on the planet. Pretty soon you realize that more than half the world has turned against the United States and its allies. This is very damaging, and it's not going to improve anytime soon. And we still don't know what will happen in the Middle East. We know that the Iranians are waiting on two things. One, the remote possibility that a ceasefire could come out of the discussions between the Israelis and Hamas and others in Doha or anywhere else. And then secondly, I think there's a large number of Russian technicians and military personnel on the ground in Iran who are trying to put together an effective integrated air and missile defense, as well as putting other weapon systems into the hands of the Iranians that will help them fight back against the Israelis. They may not be ready yet to launch in Iran as it is. And at the same time, they don't want to launch before there's a clear, unambiguous no coming out of the ceasefire talks. But when that happens, the Russians will be in a position to influence those events as well in ways that could be very, very catastrophic to our interests in the region, because the people in the region are among those who are joining BRICS, including Saudi Arabia, and are fed up with the way we have treated them and the way we have behaved in the Middle East for many decades. So I think the Russians can do a number of things. And we're just talking about the Russians. We haven't even mentioned the Chinese. The Chinese are adding naval vessels to the small contingent of 6 combatants that they have in the Indian Ocean. And they have made it very clear to the Iranians that they will stand by Iran. So all of the chips are falling in directions that are frankly antithetical to our interests. And yet no one in the media, no one in the West is really raising these issues. Americans are in the dark. They don't know what's happening. I don't know what it's like where you are, but I suspect it's not very different.
No, it's, I guess, the same. This excitement about humiliating Putin, the assumption that this might result in some regime change. I keep making the point, when the Russians look towards their screen, they see, an invading force killing civilians, kidnapping civilians. Meanwhile, the British, the Germans, they're all using this openly, saying this is a reason why they should send more weapons. And the outgoing EU foreign policy chief very gleeful, and and I think this also changed the war for the Russians. Some might have mixed feelings about fighting in Ukraine and that invasion, but now this has also become a war of national liberation and also humiliation. So for a large extent, in Moscow's eyes, I think they see this. NATO effectively putting itself in the category now of Napoleon and Hitler. This is it just seems it's gone over our head what a radical, crazy escalation this is. But it also begs the question of to what extent this will contribute to divisions in NATO, because I've seen some concerns from Italy. You mentioned the Balkans. Many of these countries, they wanted stability and defense, not join another multinational army to invade Russia. This has some poor precedents. But you also see now these conflicts between Poland and Germany over the Nord Stream, as the Poles obviously seem quite comfortable with what happened there. Hungary and Slovakia, they're being not just punished by the EU, but as Ukraine cut their energy oil supplies, the EU seemingly took the side of Ukraine against their own member states. So overall, it just seems, you can also bring up the tensions between the US and Turkey, of course, but overall, there seems to be a lot of tensions simmering within NATO. I'm just wondering how long this evil Russian boogeyman is able to ensure the solidarity within NATO, or when do we start ripping ourselves apart?
Well, it's certainly incomprehensible to me as an American soldier. And I would assume that British soldiers feel very similar, emotions. It's odd for me to see a Ukrainian wearing a helmet from the Second World War and insignia from the Second World War associated with the Waffen-SS, and somehow or another sport this in film as evidence for a success that they've achieved. And why would we ever want to support such a thing? I know many, many Germans. I don't know anyone in Germany who thinks that's a good idea. I don't see anyone who supports that. I mean, you could dismiss them as buffoons, utter buffoons who running around trying to be something they never were and are not. But the very sight of that sort of thing, and then speaking German, heavily accented Ukrainian German, to some Russian citizen, and demeaning him on top of everything else, do these people have a suicide wish? Because I think the impact in Russia has been profound. And everybody says, well, if there's a war between Russia and NATO, NATO will win. I've got news for you. When you fight with multinational forces, the multinationality, the diversity of languages and culture and attitudes, the many different kinds of equipment, all of this works against you. The Russians speak one language, a language of command, and that is Russian. And everyone inside the Russian army understands that and responds to it. So you're talking about Austria-Hungary versus Prussia in 1866. One side had strong social cohesion and homogeneity in terms of people and culture. The other side was extremely diverse. Only 40% of the soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army could actually understand German, if that. So what are we're kidding ourselves. And see, I think Mr. Putin knows that. If he doesn't, he should. And if he knows that, he also knows that if we are pushed back conventionally in a confrontation, that we are inclined to fall back on the nuclear weapon. And that's something he doesn't want. And that's one of the reasons he has exercised enormous restraint. And I think he'll continue to do so. But I would look for other actions around the world, as well as an inevitable push to rid Ukraine of this regime. I think there are probably serious discussions about getting rid of Zelensky and his crowd, because how do you negotiate with these people? How do you deal with someone that says something that's fundamentally untrue? Somebody that will never tell the truth. It's very difficult to reach agreements with people like that. So from their vantage point, it may be time to do away with him once and for all.
Yeah, no, I watched the video you're referring to as well, because it was played on French TV as well, and I found it fascinating because whenever something like this pops up, the first reaction is always to dismiss it or make excuses, or it's quite fascinating. Even with Boris Johnson waving an Azov fascist flag within the British Parliament, I never thought I would ever see things like this, but I think it's can be explained here in Europe that this willingness to follow or to maintain the solidarity in NATO and follow the United States off a cliff, it comes from the last 80 years, because during the Cold War, the United States was this anchor of stability and security, protecting us from the Soviets. And after the Cold War, the US formulated this policy of hegemonic peace, and it worked out well for the Europeans, as we saw this as being a collective hegemony. Whether or not that was ever true is another issue. But my point is, now that the world is changing very rapidly, we're not. I don't think in Europe anyone has the political imagination to think of any other foreign policy than crawling under the wing of the United States and hope it will look after our security and our interests are the same. All of this. But I think we're up for a crude awakening, because the world of which we still hope can be returned, it doesn't exist anymore.
Well, President Orbán of Hungary seems to be the last rational man in NATO, and he has warned from the very beginning of the consequences of performing acts such as the ones that we saw by the Ukrainians inside Russia on this foolish penetration attack, pretending to be Nazis. I mean, I can't conceive of any dumber idea and anything more offensive. If your objective is just to offend Russians and rub salt in the wound, you succeeded. Well done. If you're trying to prevent any reasonable negotiation from taking place, I guess Washington and London have succeeded. But I don't see this as an option for us. We have to press ahead and find some way out of this morass. Perhaps President Putin is hopeful that there will be a change in government, not only in the United States in November, but also in many other countries in Europe. There is reason for optimism. One looks at Scholz in Germany and anticipates that something's got to give there, although admittedly, they have lots of empty suits walking around in the political sphere. But you could say that about Great Britain and us. I don't know what will happen in France, but I think France is closer to boiling over than many people realize. So again, I think under those circumstances, President Putin says, let's exercise some more patience. But in the meantime, you still have to deal with this regime in Kiev. It really needs to be expunged. It's offensive and it's dangerous for everyone.
Yeah, only yesterday they banned the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. It's quite extreme, and this is what happens in conflict as well. Not only do we fuel hate against the adversary, but we apologize for anything on our side. Like banning religions, supporting fascism. Everything seems to be in the open, but so there's possibilities that there will be changes in Europe. I think definitely the failure to support or defend basic national interests will have a huge backlash. And I was curious with the United States, with the election coming up in November. How does it matter, or to what extent does it matter which side will win? They seem to have, in terms of foreign policy, the Ukrainian issue seems to be the only thing that actually divides them. But we had
Well, in
Trump before
theory,
as well, and it didn't make much of a difference, I guess.
in theory, I think President Trump, if elected, would try to end the war in Ukraine as quickly and as expediently as he can. I don't know what the plan is. Nothing has been announced. I've seen no evidence for anything in writing. This is one of the things that you've got to admit that is done very well on the left. Before they go into office, they have all of the executive orders that the president needs to sign in order to advance their policies. They have a clear strategy to do whatever they want, even though that strategy may be a bad one and it may be destructive. At least they know where they're going. I don't know that the Trump campaign understands all of that. I know that President Trump probably has something in mind, but I haven't seen the hard evidence for the kind of instant action. I mean, what needs to happen is an immediate cessation of any more military aid to Ukraine. I mean, we've already lost incredible amounts of money. We know this regime is terribly corrupt. We know that Zelensky and his crew have sent billions of dollars overseas to go into banks where they plan to live in happy isolation in the future. But I don't know that we are prepared to step in and do what's really required, which is end that aid, certainly provide humanitarian aid, and then announce the immediate withdrawal of all U.S. personnel on the ground in Ukraine. Everybody, military, civilian, intelligence, doesn't make any difference. Get them out. That would be a signal that the Russians would take seriously. But unless we're willing to do that, I don't see the Russians are going to pay much attention to anything we say, Glenn. We've bloviated before. Hasn't meant anything.
Is there any chance of you taking a position in a possible Trump government, or are you working on other things at the moment?
I'm working on other things, so I do not anticipate that at all.
And just finally, I wanted to ask you about also another possible venue for the start of another world war, which is the Middle East. I think many people have been waiting or still waiting to see what how Iran will react. And speaking of being restrained, they seem to really not want to trigger a larger war. On the other hand, I see the Europeans sent a letter to the Iranians, essentially blaming them for the entire conflict and essentially waving a red flag in front of them. It doesn't, if I was Iranian, it wouldn't seem like I have a diplomatic partner anywhere in the West at the moment. I'm just curious, where do you see this conflict going now? Things are not getting any better in Gaza. It's not getting any better between Israel and Hezbollah. Indeed, there's more now increased targeting of each other's populations, both the Israelis and Hezbollah. So I was just curious, where do you see this going? It's going to continue to escalate, or will it matter if there comes a ceasefire deal, if that's even possible?
Well, again, I can't evaluate that. I think it's unlikely. I think the possibility is remote that we get a stable ceasefire. As a result, I think the Iranian counterstrike, which is what it amounts to, it's striking back in response to things the Israelis have done to them, the assassinations and so forth. I think that probably will happen. Now, the Iranians are not fools, and they know what the Israelis are likely to do. And I think that people in the West need to understand what they're likely to do. They are probably going to destroy the oil terminals and the oil industries for all intents and purposes in the Persian Gulf, specifically in Iran and Iraq. I'd be very surprised if they did not. That, of course, is going to have a cataclysmic impact on the world economy. Effectively, that will mean that the oil and natural gas that normally would flow through the Straits of Hormuz and reach China, Japan, Korea, and other states that are desperate for the energy will not flow. Now, the Russians can certainly compensate to some extent. They'll certainly do that for China. Whether or not the Japanese can arrange something, that's another matter. The same thing is true for South Korea. So I think the world knows this in its heart, that this is likely to happen. It's not something the Iranians or anybody in the Persian Gulf want, but it's something that the Israelis will probably do. Now, the other worst case aspect is that the Israelis will decide to use nuclear weapons, both against Hezbollah, we would say tactical nuclear weapons, and also against Iran in terms of its nuclear facilities. Whether or not they're going to do that, I don't know, but they certainly have the capacity to do so. This thing could blow up, become a much wider fight, because the Russians are not going to sit by and watch Iran and Iraq pulverized out of existence. I just don't think they're going to accept that. The Chinese won't. The real question is, will the Turks finally act? Because the Turks have got to be sitting there watching this, seeing what's going on, and conclude, we won't be far behind. If the Israelis are willing to do these things to everybody else, and they may finally feel compelled to act. I know they're very worried about the situation on Cyprus. They're very worried about the situation in Egypt. And again, I'm surprised that the regime in Egypt under General Sisi is still there. I'm surprised that King Abdullah in Jordan is still there, because in those countries, the populations are extremely, extremely angry over what's happened, and are angry with their governments who've done nothing to stop the slaughter of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And for that matter, increasingly on the West Bank, where we know there's a lot of killing and a lot of hostage taking, a lot of imprisonment is underway. There's no good news here, Glenn. Let's face it. So we are not going to do anything. I think that's what people have difficulty understanding. We have a government that is effectively at the beck and call of Mr. Netanyahu. We have a government that will not act decisively under any circumstances in Eastern Europe, because that would mean they'd have to admit failure and admit that they were wrong. No one in Washington will admit such things. They'd rather see the world destroyed and millions of people die before they admit such a thing. This ruling class in Washington, we call it the Uniparty. It's very globalist in its outlook, and it's full of hatred and contempt for much of the world, especially their own population here in the United States. There's no way to rein them in or do anything. So much in people's minds depends on that 5 November election. I hope that they will not be disappointed by what happens at that point. I hope that if we do get change, it will be real and lasting. But right now, there are a lot of clouds on the horizon, and there's no evidence for any sunshine breaking through anytime soon.
Well, you're certainly correct about the Arab population being furious, and obviously this is not reflected in the policies of the leaders, but to some extent, lesser extent, obviously, you can say something similar across the West. That is, the political leadership remains very supportive of everything Israel's doing in Gaza, but among the population, there seems to be real resentment building. And I'm curious if this can have any changes in the United States, because you already seen some expressions from Washington that, perhaps Israel should be more cautious. On the other hand, it doesn't actually translate into any actions in terms of sending fewer weapons. So I'm just curious, is this all theatrics, the push for a ceasefire, which Israel doesn't seem to want, this call for protecting civilians, when obviously there's no one's prepared to send a few weapons. So how can we read the situation coming out of Washington at the moment? Is there a bit of mood change in the United States, or is it just people are cautious about alienating a large part of the population who opposes genocide.
I think very few Americans are really engaged. I know that's disappointing for you to hear, but truthfully, I don't think most Americans are really engaged in what's happening beyond the borders of their country. Now, if we begin to lose soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and equipment and ships, people will obviously be alerted. And then I think you could see serious pushback. But at the moment, I don't see any evidence for it. Now, in Europe, that's a little different. The Europeans are closer to the theater of action, both in Eastern Europe as well as in the Mediterranean. But they're going to have to take things into their own hands, because if they're expecting their elected representatives to do anything, I think they're all very disappointed. It's not going to happen. But most important, Washington, if anything, is paralyzed. And that's because people in Washington are not really connected, even to their own population in most cases. They live in a bubble. I like to refer to it as Fantasy Island. And this is a place where they believe that we are invincible, invulnerable, immune to everything, can do anything. If you've listened to President Biden speak, he makes these comments, we're the greatest country in the world. What do you mean we can't afford this? What do you mean we can't do this? And the attitude towards the sovereign national debt is, well, we can print more money. No one can stop us. No one can change anything. So in the short run, I don't see anything good happening. In the long run, however, I think our relationship with Israel is in real trouble. It's fundamentally changed. And I don't know how Israel comes out of this. I really don't. Their economy is virtually destroyed. They're subsisting on the billions that are transferred to them by us. Everything they are is a function of us at this stage. And as long as we provide, they're going to do what they do. And right now, as I've said many, many times, President or Prime Minister Netanyahu has infinitely more influence over the conduct of policy in Washington, particularly as it pertains to defense and foreign policy, than anybody in the White House.
I'm often surprised by the lack of discussion of policies in general. Also, the media control. I think I'm very skeptical, and nonetheless, it also shocked me. I thought after the assassination attempt on Trump, I thought this was going to be a big thing, something that would be in the media for more than 2-3 days. Also, Biden, who was very swiftly removed only a few hours after he was tweeting that he was still in the race. So the removal of Biden, assassination attempt against Trump, suddenly all go in the memory hole. Now we're having this politics being run as a marketing campaign where Kamala Harris is joyful and fun and Republicans are weird, and it seems almost like a bubblegum commercial. It's very strange to watch, and no one's discussing policies. We're at the feels like we're risking this not necessarily nuclear war, but world war, both in the Middle East and in Europe, and there's very little substance, not just in the United States. I see the same in Europe, but is there any hope for course correction, or will it require some real collapse in governments? Or I just I don't see any of the democratic institutions providing this course correction.
Well, you're correct in your assessment of the political parties' conventions. Both conventions were very high on glamour and entertainment and very low on information. Why is that? Because that's what appeals to the American public. That's the problem. The American public is drunk on bread and circuses. You remember, this was the thing that the Caesars learned, feed the plebeians, provide them with entertainment, and you can do pretty much what you want. The key is, of course, the standard of living. As the standard of living here falls, as things that were once in abundance become scarce, that people want and need, if they can't afford to put gas in their cars, if they can't afford to eat where they'd like to, go where they want to, and live as they like, the rising criminality that is accompanying this massive invasion from the South, all of these things are coming to a climax of some kind. And one wonders what is the trigger that will awaken the sleeping giant called America. And it may well be the war in the Middle East, because no one's really paying much attention to what happens in Eastern Europe. They really aren't. And unless, something there were to blow up, which I think is less likely, frankly, because I think Ukraine has really reached entropy. I don't expect much there. And the initiative lies with the Russians, not the Europeans. The question is what happens in the Middle East. If that blows up in a way that involves us and then affects our economy, affects the way we live over here, which I think it will, frankly, then everything changes. I mean, imagine if we were in a situation that Russia is in, and we had foreigners on the ground in Mexico, arming, training, equipping, essentially managing, directing, and planning for an army in Mexico to attack the United States. What would we do? And I asked this to several people, and people all laughed immediately and said, well, we'd turn Mexico into a parking lot. That was the immediate answer. In other words, if you interrupt us, if you disrupt our lives, if you change the standard of living, all hell will break loose. But until that happens, I wouldn't expect much. And I say this all the time to people, there were a lot of things wrong in France for decades before the French Revolution. Why did the revolution happen when it did? They were already broke. They had serious financial crisis. There were many problems in France, but it really, really broke into the open when the French population in Paris could not afford to buy bread. And I think if you are looking for the solution to this problem, I think you've got it. Some version of what happened then.
Yeah, no, I think the economics will probably have a huge role to play as well, because what we see now is that much of the world is looking with great concern, not just the United States, but the wider West, in terms of the unsustainable debt, also the weaponization of economic dependence, everything spanning from the efforts to break the Chinese chip and tech industries to legalizing the theft of Russian assets. It's just you see this efforts to diversify and decouple from the technologies and industries, the payment systems and the banks and the dollar and the euro. And I think BRICS is seemingly becoming the main institution to facilitate this. They're even now discussing setting up their own commodity exchanges and, effectively recreating the international economic architecture, being less reliant on the West. So at some point, this is gonna, I guess the main goal is when the big splash comes to get out of the way. Yeah, but it just seems this can't go on for much longer, because all of our conflicts are now building up, and they're much like the ridiculous politicians. The media has become equally ridiculous.
Keep in mind the conventional wisdom among the people that are in the ruling class, the people that work in the media, the people that work in Washington, Hollywood, is very clear. Well, the Chinese will never do X, Y, and Z because they need our markets. In other words, they have to indulge us. Everyone has to indulge us, because if our economy should collapse, if we go into a serious financial crisis, which I think we will, similar to what went on the last time, only potentially worse, then the world will not allow it because they need us. And I look at people and I shake my head in disbelief. In other words, that's like saying, I can continue to beat my neighbors to death with a baseball bat because they need me to mow their lawn. They need me to keep up their plumbing. They need me to provide candy for their children. But in the meantime, I'm going to beat their neighbors to death with a baseball bat. It doesn't make any sense. But that's the thinking. They have to do this because we're the big dog. No one can get along without us. And as soon as you make these kinds of comments, that you're at the end. And I shudder to think what is coming, because this kind of arrogance on stilts is completely unacceptable. The average American is not part of this. And I stress that because you've got a large audience in Europe. The average American is not part of this. The average American is a victim of it. Now, you can argue that Americans should have taken a greater interest in the past than they have in what happens overseas, in what is the decisions that are made in Washington. Right now, they're horrified at what they see coming into the country over the southern border. They're horrified at the criminality. The Venezuelan gangs that are raping and murdering little girls. Remember President Trump made a comment about rapists coming into the country, and he was immediately tarred and feathered as an evil racist because he made such a suggestion. Well, the hard facts are there. This is not speculation. It's happening. And Venezuelans will tell you it's happening because they emptied their jails and sent whatever they could north. This is not an accident, and we have played into this. Our own government has facilitated this, and people are angry, but they're not yet ready to act. I think the average American wants to believe that his republic still has life in it, and that we've got to go and try to vote out the people that we don't like. I hope it works, and I hope that what we get as a result of that is real change. My concern is that we will not get exactly what we want, and things will not improve. But I could be wrong, and I certainly hope that I am.